And apologies to those in the room and online for the slightly late start. You're very welcome here to James House. Thank you for coming to join us for our seminar to launch our Human Rights Review on Privacy and Policing. I'm Sinead Simpson, the Chief Executive of the Policing Board. After my introduction, the Board's independent Human Rights Advisor, John Wadham, is going to walk us through the report, and then our panel are going to take some questions. We have joining us today ACC Chris Todd, Fraser Sampson, the recently appointed First Surveillance Camera and Biometrics Commissioner, that just rolls off the tongue really easily, is going to be online. And we also have independent member of the Policing Board, Les Allenby, who's going to join the panel. Les has taken a close interest in this area of work on the board and is a former Human Rights Commissioner. And we also have our Vice Chair and a number of other board members here today. So you're all very welcome. Just a little bit of housekeeping. If anybody needs to leave before the end of the event, if you use this door, which takes you out to a foyer area, and then there's lifts down to the reception and the main entrance of James House. So just to sort of set the scene a little bit, the board's work and oversight arrangements in respect of monitoring human rights has often been recognised, referenced and recognised nationally and internationally as a model of good practice. But it's an area of work that continues to evolve with changes in policing, societal change, and, as is the focus of this report, new technology. At our June meeting, as some of our members in the room will remember, the Director General of the National Crime Agency was there updating the board, and in answer to a question, he asked, is abuse of your avatar in the metaverse a crime? I didn't even know what some of those words meant. But anyway, we're now living in a new world technologically, and that new world means that policing and law enforcement have to become ever more sophisticated in dealing with crime and criminality. This report, which John's going to walk us through, is an ambitious piece of work, and it's the first of its kind, so far as we know, in policing in Northern Ireland and elsewhere. And it attempts to highlight how important the right to privacy is and its continued significance as policing and surveillance technologies become more sophisticated. The Human Rights Advisor and officials have done extensive research and consulted widely over the last 6 months, from engaging with different branches in PSNI to NGOs and other public bodies. Topics covered in this report include access to databases, biometric collection, searching and retention, artificial intelligence, surveillance, digital forensics, and data protection at PSNI. Access to data and technology like facial recognition have the potential to support officers in solving crimes and other duties. But these tools must be used in a responsible way to ensure public trust and confidence in them. John, as with his predecessors, has provided the board with independent advice and expertise on PSNI's compliance with human rights legislation through written reports and recommendations. He has unfettered access to all parts and people within PSNI, which means he can access and assess any information necessary to inform his advice to the board. And I'd like to thank the various officers and staff in PSNI for their assistance with his work, and in particular this report. The report contains 6 recommendations for PSNI, 2 of which also involve the board. The recommendations reflect the need for a wider public debate in Northern Ireland around privacy and policing with stakeholders, many of which are present here today. And the Policing Board is committed to taking an active role in the governance of data ethics in policing to ensure privacy rights are protected and to encourage this public debate. Having a positive human rights culture in our policing service and a willingness to be held to account to the community through the Policing Board is welcome. And it is work that we are committed to. And with that, I'm going to hand over to John, our Human Rights Advisor, to walk you through the report. Okay, John?
Thank you, Sinead. So, 342 footnotes, and there'll be questions about whether you read them all at the end of this session. So how private are our private lives? In my view, the right to privacy in Northern Ireland, but also wider in the UK, is probably the weakest of all of our rights. PSNI can access databases with millions of people's records. The UK Police National Computer, which they have access to, has got 8.5 million driver records, 62.6 million vehicle records. And also the PSNI can seek matches with 18.5 million custody images from the Police National Database. And the Police National Database system handles more than 1.5 billion records. I can't believe that's true, but apparently it is. I've read the report. And also, of course, routine searches, which is a concern of the policing board, are made against Home Office immigration databases as well, which is something that the board's concerned about. And a particular issue with intelligence databases, not surprisingly, is you can't get access. Now, of course, there are rules about accessing your subject access from most databases, but there are problems with accessing police databases when it's about intelligence, not your actual criminal record. And sometimes we know when people do have access for their material on data that it can be wrong. And it becomes even more problematic when images or other data is not deleted from the databases and gets left there. And that, I'm afraid, is the case with the databases and policing in the UK and Northern Ireland. And, of course, if that wasn't enough, police officers have access to information held on everyone else's databases. So, your store cards, the NHS, bank accounts, obviously only in relation to the prevention of crime or identifying offenders. And, of course, if that wasn't enough, we all carry our own tracking device as well with us. So, as you know, you can find out where you've been and where you're going sometimes, and obviously, apart from that, all your social media is available. So that I think raises some questions which I'll come back to later. So then, of course, there is biometric databases where technology makes people's faces readable. PSNI hold a lot of DNA databases, or one database with lots of information. And unfortunately, hundreds of people in Northern Ireland have data on that database which is being held unlawfully. And that we know that because in 2008 there was a case that went to the European Court of Human Rights in relation to the UK generally, and it particularly concerned people who've had their data taken but then weren't convicted of crimes. They were either not prosecuted or they were acquitted. That material is still on the Northern Ireland databases, not in England and Wales, because when the coalition government came in, they produced something called the Protection of Freedoms Act, which didn't quite work its way across to Northern Ireland. And of course, we all know the concerns about issues of AI and how that works generally, but also particularly in relation to facial recognition and the danger that that is discriminatory. And we've seen cases from the UK where issues like that have been raised. Lifetime facial recognition is not part of the PSNI's work yet, but it is being considered. So then, of course, there is what we would call open surveillance. So there's about 120 cameras in CCTV cameras in Belfast city centre, which you've probably all seen, or seen some of them. I'm not sure whether you've seen them all. But most cameras in Northern Ireland are not operated by the police, but operated by community groups or private sector bodies. That doesn't mean, of course, that the police can't have access to them. So I'm sure that you've seen when you go and fill up your car with petrol or diesel, if you've got a diesel car, and you'll see there's usually CCTV, and so therefore if you drive off without paying, they can track you down. And of course, if there's an offence, somebody commits an offence in a garage, for instance, then the first place the police can go to the garage and they'll say, show us your CCTV. You've probably all know all this because you've seen so many cop programmes on the TV. And then, of course, there's the ANPR sites. Those are the sites where there are cameras that read your car's registration number, so they can track you They use it mainly, obviously, for tracking people that are wanted, or for cars that aren't properly registered or don't have tax or insurance, etc. And of course, this video surveillance produces a vast amount of material. In fact, ANPR systems read 100 million vehicle number plates, or did in 1 year. Then, of course, there are private homes have CCTV around them. You've seen that. Some of them work on doorbells. You ring the doorbell and it starts the camera running. And in the investigation into the outrageous shooting of John Caldwell, apparently there was something like 100,000 hours of material that the police were using to investigate. And of course, that's a positive thing. I think they can track down individuals, and there have been arrests. I can't really comment on the details of those for obvious reasons. And then there's something else that we call targeted surveillance. This is about, in a sense, covert processes. And with covert processes, it's difficult for us collectively as a community to hold the police to account, because those processes have to be secret. There are mechanisms. There's lots of acronyms, I'm afraid. The Investigatory Powers Commissioner's Office, the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, the Policing Board has a role, and does, as I do as the Human Rights Advisor, as Sinead said, I have access to this material. But of course, this targeted surveillance consists of listening into your telephone calls, or looking at your messages, or communications data, as it's called. In other words, not looking at the content of that material, but the fact that you have been in touch with a particular person. In other words, on this date you text this person, or on this date on time you phone this person. And that can be useful in terms of tracking down what you were up to at any particular time. And of course, through cell systems access, they can find out where you are at any particular time if your phone is beeping, which it always is, though. And then there's access to your computer remotely. Some people call that hacking, but computer interference. Then there's, I'm sorry, this is such a long list. Then there's what's called directed surveillance, which is that an individual is suspected of committing crime, so the police will actually keep that person under surveillance. And then there's then in addition to that, it's called intrusive surveillance, where they can access your home or office and place a listening device or camera in your home and office, leave it there, and it either records or it sends a message. And then finally, particularly in Britain generally, but also mainly and particularly in Northern Ireland, there are what we call informants, or covert human intelligence sources. They have a controversial history, and they have a controversial history in London. You may have seen recently there's an public inquiry in the use of undercover police officers in London, and it's been found that they were enmeshed in a whole series of political parties and political protests organisations in London. And then, as I say, in relation to your device, not only is it an issue about tracking, etc., it of course has lots and lots of data on it. So when someone is a suspect, then it may be that data is useful for the police, so they have to download it. That's a complicated process, and there's been an ICO investigation into the failures, unfortunately, of the PSNI in how they did this. But it also affects victims. As you know, it's been a particular issue for women who are sexually assaulted by people that they know, and so the question sometimes will be, does the police need to access the communications that exist between the person who has allegedly assaulted the woman and the person themselves? And so therefore, were there texts after the event which might undercut her story, etc.? You've heard this, and that's a particular problem. And of course, from the police perspective, they want to know all of that, and there are now protocols in place to try and avoid the whole telephone being available to the police, but then also the whole of the data on the telephone being available to the suspect. Several checks and balances is in place. Well, okay, so what do we do about all that? It's clear to me, at least, that the technological changes are going much faster than the processes to ensure that we hold the PSNI to account. So it's not that these new technologies should be banned. They do assist the PSNI to fight crime and to keep us all safe. However, the process of democratic oversight in Northern Ireland is even more problematic, I would say, than it is in the UK. And I'm not making a political point about the lack of the Assembly, though that does contribute to the problems, obviously. There's an issue about who knows anything about all of this, who's talking about any of this, and what should we do about this? And I don't have any easy answers, but our recommendations hopefully set a possible agenda for the future about how we can, as a community in Northern Ireland, start to begin these discussions and what's the role of the PSNI, the DOJ, the Assembly, and of course the PSNI particularly. And so part of what I would like to see is a biometrics and surveillance camera commissioner for Northern Ireland. We have the next speaker is going to talk about his role in relation to the UK and his less comprehensive role in Northern Ireland. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. So as John said, we're now going to hand over to Fraser Sampson, who's the Biometrics and Surveillance Camera Commissioner. So hopefully if the technology works okay, we'll be able to see Fraser. So over to you, Fraser.
Sinead, thank you very much. Can I just make sure that the sound is coming through?
Yes, we can hear you, Fraser.
Yeah, you can hear me. Thank you. And also thank you for using a much younger photograph of me. That's great. I don't know if we supplied it, but yeah, you'll see the reality with this technology is moving along. But thank you very much for sharing this report, John, and the opportunity to discuss it here. It's very thoughtful and thorough, as I would have expected, but it's also very timely. And just before looking at some of the functions that I have and where they dovetail with some of the content of the report, I thought it might be helpful just to pick up 3 points of context. So the first one is trust and confidence of our communities. And the more the police can do with digital technology, the more important it's going to be for them to be able to show what they're not doing with it at any one time. And I don't think there's enough, or in some cases even any focus on that, certainly in the areas that I cover. And I think that's going to become increasingly important with the use of AI-driven technologies. And we also have to be able to trust our private sector technology partners. And the second thing is arises under policing by consent. And the police can't infer consent from the casual abandonment of privacy in our everyday lives. So what I mean by that is that just because people are happy to use their face to open a bank account or get a boarding pass for a plane doesn't mean they're agreeing to their picture being used to open a police file about them attending, for example, a public protest. And that's often confused in some of the policing that I get involved in. The third thing is that privacy and police surveillance involves processing of personal data. Of course it does, but so does every other meaningful organizational activity nowadays. Police surveillance and privacy, to me, is no more just data protection than DNA profiling is just chemistry. And to leave accountable governance in this area to data protection alone will not address some of the principal concerns of either the citizen or the police as set out in your report. So against those contextual issues, my combined roles are described in chapter 5, in particular in the report, and elsewhere. I'm both the biometrics commissioner, which is a UK-wide responsibility, and I'm the Surveillance Camera Commissioner for Policing and Local Authorities across England and Wales. I'm also, largely at night time, a Professor of Governance and National Security at Sheffield Hallam University. But I think biometrics and surveillance cover a very wide remit, and I've picked out a couple of areas of overlap with the report's content that kind of illustrate my role and where it's relevant to the matters covered in this report. In terms of surveillance cameras, I cover public space surveillance by all police bodies and local authorities in England and Wales. That covers every platform. That's drones, body-worn video, ANPR, and every other manifestation, including discussions around self-driving vehicles in the future. In terms of retention and use of biometrics by the police, I have a UK-wide remit for national security and CT, counterterrorism use of retained biometrics materials, and any applications by chief police officers to retain the biometrics of individuals on the grounds of national security where they have never been convicted of recordable offence have to come through me and my office. I think one of the really important functions that I have in both directions is official reporting to ministers and to Parliament. That's critical. And as an example, I found successive annual reports for Biometrics Commissioner, annual reports, in which large numbers, I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands, of unlawful retentions were reported each year by counterterrorism policing. And I mean, there are technological reasons for this, which I understand. But the reporting of that left unaddressed, I think, undermines both the legitimacy and the efficacy of the entire governance framework. If you actually have a heading that has worked its way into your annual report each year, entitled Unlawful Retentions, I think we're missing the point. And I think eventually that will become corrosive of public trust. The important bit is that you flag it up and then do something about it. And I think we share some of those issues here. And I have done something about it with the help of counterterrorism policing in the Met. Another issue is the ethical and HR, human rights compliance use of public space surveillance, which again, John and the report touched on. So in terms of its use by police and local authorities, when I came into this role, I was alarmed to find that both were using surveillance equipment from state-directed companies in China that have been directly linked to police internment and torture of religious and national minority groups in re-education camps in Xinjiang. Even the College of Policing, who are the guardians of the Police Code of Ethics, have recently upgraded, in very heavy speech marks, their on-site high vision surveillance systems. And one of my questions has been and remains, how does this sit with their expressed core values and the oath sworn by their officers? A further point that, John, you mentioned that, and the report focuses on, understandably, is facial recognition in all its forms. This is one of the most contentious aspects of police biometrics at the moment. In my view, it can be, and probably will be, a game-changing technology if it's used accountably, sensibly, and thoughtfully, while AI, artificial intelligence, will amplify concerns that we already have and will simply accelerate the speed at which we can get things wrong if we're not careful about it. So one of the reasons why I've worked for a couple of years on an accountability framework for the accountable use of artificial intelligence in policing. I've done that with my university hat on, and we've worked very closely with Europol and the Fundamental Rights Agency in Europe. I've been over to Belfast and presented this with university colleagues to Chris Todd, who I gather is in the audience. Chris, but I can't see you. And this is a ready-to-use accountability framework, which the university is very happy to make available to policing bodies such as the board. And then finally, if I may, to sum up some of the issues in here and the importance of chronology. Last month, I was lucky enough to be asked to speak at an international biometrics conference in Sydney. And one of the quieter nations in the room was Tonga. And the Tongan representative said that when we're thinking of using new biometrics technology in our country, First, we build the trust, and then we build the system. And I thought, well, this is the exact opposite of what we have done in Europe and North America. And as far as I was concerned, it was the best contribution of the entire week. I've made a few unexpected friends since in Pacific Island states by name checking Tonga, and I promise that I will name check them at every other opportunity since, because getting the trust built first before we start experimenting with the technology and pointing things at citizens whose money we use to pay for it, I think is a very important point that ought not to be lost. And it's so important that if we can get this the right way round with what you're doing in Northern Ireland, then I think that will be an extremely good start and something for the rest of us to watch carefully. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Fraser. Thanks very much for your input. It's really good to hear from someone who's at least partway down the journey. Can I now invite our panellists to take a seat, John, Les and Chris, and if you want to take a seat up here, folks. Thank you. We're now going to have a bit of a Q&A with the panel. Just to say also, we're going to be publishing this seminar on our YouTube channel, so if anyone has a question in the room, online, and you don't want to be identified, if you just want to state your question and perhaps what organisation you're from, that would be helpful, and Lorraine's going to let us know if there are any, and we can read those out. Just if I can open up the discussion. I mean, obviously we've had input from John and from Fraser, and thank you for that. But just ACC Todd, just to give you a chance, and I should say at the outset, Chris is under a bit of time pressure, so we're probably going to try and direct any questions that we have to Chris and allow him to get away. But just an initial question, Chris, could you give us and give folk in the room here and online an insight into what the police's initial response is to the report that you've had from the board? If you want to use your mic, Chris. Thank you.
So that should be coming through hopefully now. So thank you, Sinead, and thank you, John, and Fraser as well. We've been involved in consultation along the way with the report, so welcome that, of course. It's a fairly hefty report. I've got a copy here, so we'll go through it in more detail in due course and work closely with the board, obviously. But broadly, my comments are that I welcome it. So it's really important that policing makes the best use of data and technology to keep people safe as effectively as we possibly can. And of course, new technologies bring opportunities for policing to do that more effectively and more efficiently. But they also bring challenges as well, and these have rightly been discussed within this report. So it's vital that in order to maintain trust and confidence within our communities that we serve, and that we continue to be a legitimate police service, that we are held to account, and that the scrutiny is tight. And we need that independent thought and challenge which this report brings. Human rights absolutely needs to be a cornerstone of policing for the Police Service of Northern Ireland, and will continue to be so. But of course, we have to balance those rights, and John rightly pointed out some of the challenges that we need to consider when we're using new technologies and data to a greater degree. So privacy is something which clearly has to be of concern to us, and we need to manage that very carefully. But we also need to balance that against our obligations as a police service to consider the Article 2 and 3 rights of individuals and keep people safe and protect people from harm as well, and the opportunities that some of these technologies can give us, and that balance is very important. But if we don't have that challenge, we don't have that scrutiny, we don't have that independent thought in the room, then there's always a danger that we don't maintain that balance correctly. So for those reasons, I welcome the report, and I look forward to working with John and others to go through the recommendations in detail and see exactly how we can improve the service that we provide for the communities that we serve.
Okay. Okay, thanks very much, Chris. Maybe just before I come to the floor, maybe just a couple more, one for Les and one for Fraser. Les, Fraser talked about the importance of building trust before you build the systems. You may be sort of thinking about that. What do you see as the role for the board in terms of oversight of these new and developing technologies and how we can contribute to this changing space?
Thanks, Sinead. Yeah, I think we have two roles. The first one is actually about being a catalyst for a debate around technology and surveillance and policing, and that's what this report does. I think it's the first report I've seen anywhere in Northern Ireland that actually sets out what techniques police are using in one place. So the starting point is to have that debate and to bring in the relevant stakeholders, and the recommendations set up a framework for doing that. There's some good practice out there in Scotland that we can build on. So we're setting out a path which, if PSNI come with us, and I think they will, can allow us to build the trust that Fraser was talking about. The second issue is we obviously have a role in terms of oversight around police policies and strategies and plans. My experience of technology is it moves on at a pace and the safeguards are always trying to catch up afterwards. So we need to do something that at least knows what's happening in the field so that we can step back and think about these things. We're also behind in Northern Ireland. Fraser set out that effectively some of the powers he has in terms of oversight for England and Wales, there's now a Scottish commissioner. We don't have a commissioner here, so we lack some of that oversight. John also mentioned the fact that the Criminal Justice Act, which was passed by the Assembly, has never been implemented. And the history of this very quickly is that there was a case in 2008, Essen Marper, when there used to be blanket retention of all material across the UK. That was held to be unlawful. England, Scotland and Wales put in legislation that effectively was more discriminatory in terms of what was to be retained. Northern Ireland never has. And as a result, and further recent cases, it's pretty clear, and this is not PSNI's fault, PSNI are operating a regime that is not human rights compliant. So they're very badly exposed in those terms. And to give you an extent to which we are doing this, I remember my time at the Human Rights Commission, it's in the public domain, but 4 years ago, it was said that PSNI hold almost 250,000 people's fingerprints in Northern Ireland and close on 200,000 people's DNA. Well, your DNA isn't just about identifying you individually, it contains other biometric information, so it has very significant kind of privacy issues. That's 4 years ago. I suspect those numbers have increased. And I remember in a conversation with a senior PSNI officer who said, if we applied the law in 2013, which I think would actually now be out of date anyway in human rights terms, we'd have to get rid of about a third of the fingerprints that we hold. So that gives you a sense of the extent of this. And I fall back finally on on human rights. What is Article 8? I mean, Chris is quite right. All of this is really important in terms of policing. There's a legitimate aim in terms of tackling crime, but your right to privacy isn't an absolute right. However, any interference with that right must be in accordance with the law, it must be necessary in a democratic society, it must be proportionate, and it must be no more than is required. And that's a pretty good template to start from. So I think our role is very much to make sure that those human rights issues are taken seriously and that we keep up with what's happening, and that we stimulate that public debate. So I think all of that is part of our role. And I think today's publication is, as I say, the start of a journey, but it's an important journey because you do need to win public confidence. And the history of this, frankly, tends to be change happens after the event, when suddenly people realise the full extent of what's going on, but it's only when it's been exposed because of particular issues. And we need to find a way of getting on the front foot rather than constantly being on the back foot.
Okay, Les, thank you very much. And that's probably a good lead into the question for Fraser. So Les has articulated a couple of roles for the board, but very clearly, so clearly a governance role for us and a role for helping to get the debate going and continuing. But given the ever-changing role of technology, I suppose you're also pointing to the need for something more than what the board can provide. So Fraser, from your experience, could you tell us what you see as being the benefit of having a biometrics commissioner here in Northern Ireland? And I know you've kind of touched on some of that already, but maybe you could expand on that for us.
Thank you. Yes. So I think one of the things that I've found in this role is the independence, i.e., you are at least arm's length from policing, in my case, and local authorities and the government. In some cases, it feels like the length of the arm is a 10-foot pole. And that's not particularly unhelpful, really, given that one of the difficulties goes back to my point about, relying on trust and confidence, particularly with communities. One of the difficulties is if you say something and you're part of policing, then you're always going to have it diluted with the view that, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? The same is true of the government. But if you're a wholly independent third party and you are seen to operate in that way as well, so it goes beyond day one of appointment, that can be very helpful, both in terms of inculcating trust in certain areas, and also in terms of coverage that you will get from different sort of media outlets. Because if you're simply banging an organisational drum or repeating phrases that have been heard time and time again from other sort of embedded sections of the group, then people aren't going to give you a lot of airspace, really. And the second thing for me, which I reported back to the Joint Committee on Human Rights in Parliament in February, is the recognition for the post holder that actually, when you look at something like biometric retention for national security reasons, the individual will never know that they've had such an order made against them or considered. They wouldn't probably be able to challenge that practically if they wanted to do in judicial review, because you wouldn't get disclosure of the relevant documents. In which case, the only person in the entire chain that isn't there to ensure retention of those biometrics from that citizen is me. And I think that it's an important role. But also I recognise that that is why I'm there. And therefore I do push back in a way. I'm not there as their representative or their advocate, but I'm kind of in this quasi-judicial assistance role that makes sure that the police, in putting forward their case, albeit in a very sort of secret and protected communication arrangements, have considered all the issues, that they have met the various statutory tests, and that their proposal to retain people's biometrics and increasingly share them around the world withstands sort of proper challenge. But again, we come back to the trust and confidence issues, because that all takes place behind closed doors, and even because some of the reports I do, and I've only done one in this role, and that went to the Home Secretary last November, has to be treated with confidence, then you need a great deal of trust in the people that are involved in that. And I think you can start by appointment, but the only way you can keep that is by demonstrating that is a system which can be trusted.
Fraser, just one final question from me, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor and online. So, ACC, Todd, How would you assess the future of sort of developments in technology in policing, and I know that you have a national role in this space as well. So where do you see the technology going in policing terms, and what might the issues be that we'll be dealing with 6, 9, 12 months down the road?
That's a really difficult question, isn't it? Because that's the thing with technology, is it develops so rapidly. But that's one of the concerns, and one of the challenges around the use of technology and data is that things do develop exponentially in this area. So it would be really difficult to predict exactly where we're going to be in 5 years' time from now. So the principles, I think, are important to get right around our use of these capabilities. I really did like that comment that Fraser shared with us from Tonga about build the trust and then build the system. And I think that's one of the principles that we can build into this. So the technologies will develop, and they'll often be driven by private industry rather than by policing or other public bodies. And then it's how we use them, which is really important. So building the trust before we adopt the systems, I think, is something we can do, whatever those systems may be. So, somebody might ask a question, for example, about generative AI, chat GPT, for example, and what that means. The understanding of that capability is something which is probably not well known to that many people. The idea that it doesn't just kind of think for itself and generate stuff, it just scrapes information which has already been generated by somebody else and puts it together, presents challenges as to the veracity of that information. So if police were to adopt the use of that, for example, there would be huge risks in that, which without proper understanding and exploration, people might, with goodwill, start using capabilities as they develop. So having these structures in place to ensure that we are able to build the trust before we adopt the capability, I think is really important. And that requires independent scrutiny. It requires external reference. But of course, when you're talking about data, when you're talking about technology, it also requires a degree of expertise as well. So getting the right groups of people together to advise and influence and ensure that we are considering everything from every angle will be really important, whatever these technologies are, I think.
Thanks, Fiona. If you could just let us know who you are, if you're comfortable, or what organisation you're from.
Hi everyone, Hannah Russell from the Human Rights Commission. I'm sure Les knows that this one's probably coming more to him than others, but thank you for having today's event. All of the brief conversations have been really useful. I have two quick questions, if that's okay. Les, you had flagged the Cochrane case and all the other cases that kind of are linked into that, and also had flagged that there have been a number of developments even since that finding has come through that has created difficulties. But, and this isn't just for Les, others, your thoughts are very welcomed. How do we reach a point of compliance practically, is the first one. And then the second one is on the online safety bill. So it may not apply directly in this scenario, but there will be a number of principles that will come out of that bill. And I suppose my question is, do you feel that those principles may be relevant, and if so, how? Thank you.
Okay, you happy to take that, Les, in the first instance?
Yeah. I'll perhaps answer the first one. The only way you can guarantee this is through legislation. DOJ's brought some legislation forward. It didn't get through before the Assembly and the Executive fell. My understanding is even if the Executive and Assembly comes back, let's say in the next 3 to 6 months, it'll be 2025 before that happens. I understand there is a service instruction to apply and practice the 2013 legislation, but we know from Cochrane that even that is almost certainly out of date. When I was at the Commission, we sat down, it was PSNI's policy, but we worked through a policy, I think very constructively, which was to effectively reflect the 2013 legislation, but yet again, that's kind of gone by the wayside. So the only real compliance will have to be a proper legislative compliance. That's where the extension of oversight and the kind of role that Fraser plays to Northern Ireland would also have to be put in place, and that has to be legislation as well. So we are some way from that, and I have considerable sympathy for PSNI because this is not a problem of their making. Essentially, we don't have the legislation in place, and they're placed in the unenviable kind of task of recognising that they're acting, frankly, with blanket retention outside the law. So how do they then decide to do it? And the other issue about shining a bit of light on this, the Commission very quickly had an interesting case where a man who, there was a fight outside his house. He went out as a peacemaker and was the peacemaker, resolved it. The police had been called. Initially, all three were arrested. All three's biometrics were taken. Very quickly, the police realised that the individual was not the perpetrator, but was the peacemaker, and that was fine. However, he'd had a conviction for a minor assault, a £50 fine 17 years earlier, so PSNI decided to retain his biometric material. He then had tried to find out, A, if it had been retained or not, and it was almost impossible to find out of his own bat. And eventually, we were able, through the Commission at that time, to get it destroyed. But he was incredibly tenacious, and it needed that level of tenacity to get to the stage where that happened. And I remember at that time, and this is a very nerdy thing to do, but I went to a library and said, could you get me information on how I might challenge retention of biometric material? And you know that librarians love a challenge. And the librarian came back about 20 minutes, 30 minutes later, I was working live, and said, I can find no material anywhere that I can help you with this. Now, if you'd gone in and said, I want to appeal a social security decision to turn me down for benefit, a librarian could have turned up any number of things about how you could appeal that. So the level of information you can get about this in that area of public life compared to the other is kind of telling. The online safety bill is, I think, really interesting because it is trying to, much of it's about regulation of the private tech sector, and it's being pushed back, some of which I think has some legitimacy, some of which I think is private sector's antipathy to any form of regulation that isn't self-regulation. So I think it's slightly tangential to these issues, but that notion of keeping oversight at bay, and Chris was very clear about this, a lot of the material that police rely on is coming from the private sector. And the interesting thing about Chinese cameras is, well, does anybody believe that if you had a demonstration, whether it was in Belfast or London, about the treatment of Uyghurs, and there are cameras there, that information is not necessarily going back to the Chinese state? That's a real and genuine worry, frankly. So this has global as well as very local significance.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Chris. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just going to come back, Hannah, and add to what Les said on the first point about the retention of biometrics, if I may. So I would hope that if Les went into the library now, that they would be able to search online and would find information from the service which would assist now. So we do have a biometric stratification committee who will consider anybody's challenge as to why their biometrics are being retained. There are certain criteria that they work through. That is not the end of the matter. There's then a process of appeal. The appeal body happens to be me as the senior officer responsible for this area within the service. I work through criteria as well, but again, I'm always reassured that whereas the legislation that is available to us, notwithstanding the Criminal Justice Act 2013, hasn't been enacted, so we're restricted by the legislation which is in place, and the wording within some of the relevant legislation is may retain indefinitely, so that gives me an option to consider and to apply a human rights framework to those considerations and look at the principles of GOFRA and other legislation which may not be enacted, but we can't unknow, and see if that's applicable. And then the public should be reassured again that I accept I am not legally trained in this respect. One of the criteria that I apply when I'm considering whether biometrics should be deleted is if there's judicial direction. So after the appeal, there is always recourse to the judiciary. So notwithstanding that legislation needs to change and needs to catch up, that remains available to the public, and they should be assured by that.
Thanks, Chris. Okay.
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, there's a lot of detail. I'm not going to comment on the online safety bill. It's a bit too complicated, I think, for me to give my views at the moment. But the recommendation 6 has got a long list of more detailed proposals. But of course, 2 of those relate to the issue of biometric retention, E and F, where I'm saying, and the board's saying that we need to fix the problem, as Chris and Les have mentioned. But also, and then F is there isn't any public information. Maybe there is now, and in which case this is out of date. I'm almost tempted to say, go and see a solicitor and get compensation out of the PS9. There are thousands of people who could do that. It wouldn't be sensible. It would be sensible for the Assembly and the PSNI to fix the problem in advance, and maybe they would if you threatened judicial review or civil action. And I'm a strategic litigator, so I'm very happy if I didn't have this job to do that, but I can't, so I won't. Thank you.
I think we'll keep you fully occupied for another while yet. Okay. Fraser, it's a bit hard because you're on Zoom. I don't want to put you on the spot. Do you want to add anything that's been said, or are you happy we'll move on?
No, it's not hard at all. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I'll duck the online safety bill thing for a number of sort of policy and functional reasons. But I think there's some really interesting issues that question raises. The first is litigation itself. If you look at the landscape that we currently work within, including GDPR, including the Law Enforcement Directive, which covers all European member states, including the United States privacy and data arrangements. None of these are the product of some eureka policy moment. We were sued here. All of these are the product of being sued, generally by people or sometimes organizations who've asked really basic questions like, how long are you going to hang on to this and under what power? And then they have had one of 2 answers. Either we don't know or we're not telling you, both of which will drive people like John to carry on banging at the door and eventually put them in front of a judge. The problem with litigation, if you're not a lawyer, as a solution, is it's probably the most unpredictable and most expensive way of formulating policy. But I go back to my original point, which is it does nothing for public trust and confidence, the fact that you have to be having this Punch and Judy litigation the whole time in order to find a way through. But that links back to what Chris said, which is you can do a great deal with policy within your own organisation. If you're chief officers, you have a great deal of latitude for your own setting your own policy, and that might include where you seek advice from, having your own internal appeal boards that are set up, not because either a judge or an assembly has told you you've got to, but because it's the right thing to do in order to get the job done and balance the considerations that we've discussed here. And I think while you wait for a legislative process, that is always a particular option. In terms of appointments and powers and things, you can't do that without legislative underpinning. But I think avoiding the litigation by careful, thoughtful policies borne out by promises that are made from senior leadership is really valuable and should be explored.
Thanks, Hannah. Great question. Happy with the contributions? Yeah, okay. Any other question? Any online, Lorraine? No? Okay. Go ahead. There's Fiona, if you get the mic over here, and then to Jackie afterwards.
Thanks. I don't have a question as such, but I just...
Mind telling us where you are away from? Yeah.
Yeah. It's Ken MacDonald from the Information Commissioner's Office. As I say, I don't have a question as such, but I just want to make some comments on the recommendations and thank John for them. We had a very interesting discussion with him during the preparation of the report. Clearly, we'd welcome the opportunity to be on the round table in next January that you propose, but also I think we've got a contribution to make in terms of the data ethics, and welcome that opportunity as well. You made reference in your talk to the mobile phone extraction and the failings of PSNI in our UK-wide investigation, but I do want to say that since then PSNI have been very open with us, and I've been serving on the Gold Group looking at the implementation of these recommendations, and that's moving forward. Similarly, in terms of access to information, which is of course helping people discover what is held about them, helping about publication of the policies and procedures. PSNI, unfortunately, this time a couple of years ago, had a very, very poor record in terms of compliance on responses to data subject access requests and to FI requests. We worked with them, and they have changed over the course of 18 months, compliance rates that were down at 40% within the time period, up to over 90%. And I think, you know, we've got to recognise the vast improvement that they've made. And again, I sit in a Gold Group. There was supposed to be one today, Chris. I think that's been postponed until tomorrow as a consequence of this. And my only concern, and maybe this is where there's the question, is you've made that great improvement, but we're facing budget cuts. And how can you guarantee that you'll be able to maintain them for the future?
Okay, Ken, thank you very much. Chris, would you like to take?
Yeah, thank you, Ken, and thank you for your support throughout, and your team were here recently to do an audit as well, so you get some more detail coming back as a result of that. Specifically around that point, it's a really valid point, and it's one that's exercised me as I've seen the improvements in those levels of performance around subject access requests and freedom of information. I think 12 months, it's been consecutively every month at that level, which is fantastic to see. We did put additional staff in there and in order to firefight really at the beginning. So part of our strategy has been to recognise that that's not sustainable, particularly in the current financial climate. So we have looked at a restructuring of that team, and what we've identified is that some of the pain points were within the decision making, and when you have practitioners who are recruited in a certain way to do very transactional roles, and then they're passing everything up the chain to make decisions, that becomes a pinch point, and that's what we've addressed. So we're looking at the structure within there, which would be cost neutral, but we empower people through a different role profile to actually make decisions themselves. And that hopefully will mean that we can sustain that level of performance.
A very relevant question, Ken, right across a number of areas of policing at the moment. Okay, Jackie had a question. Fiona, if you wouldn't mind bringing the mic over.
Thank you. I'm Jackie Durkin, Chief Inspector of Criminal Justice in Northern Ireland, and my question was about the recommendations. Most of the recommendations are time-bounded, and the sixth recommendation suggests that there should be more immediate consideration. So given that a lot of the recommendations are time-bounded, is there a sense of momentum at the minute? Are the police service confident that they have the skills and capacity to take them forward in that time frame? And are the policing board going to provide that oversight to make sure that there is momentum on them?
Chris, do you want to comment first from a police perspective?
Yeah, thank you. So as I said earlier, we work through the recommendations, very carefully, one at a time. I think you were focusing particularly on 6 there, is that?
Well, you know how criminal justice inspection love a good recommendation, and given that many of them are time-bounded within a 6-month period, that there's going to be something done within 6 months. I mean, are you confident that that's going to be delivered? And the 6th one envisages, as stated in the report, immediate consideration, which infers there's something happening now on that 6th one, if it's going to be before the others that are time bounded within a 6, and there's one of them I think for April 24.
So there is some stuff that is absolutely going on now. So if I look at recommendation 6 in particular, you look at D around data protection impact assessments. That's something we are doing already, and we will continue to do and improve upon. There are some of those which, quite frankly, are not my gift to give. So the convening of structures by the policing board is obviously something that I'll need the support of the policing board, and some of these will be led by the policing board. Some of the other elements towards the bottom there are dependent on other bodies such as the Department of Justice. So where it's in my gift to give, then I will put every effort into delivering in as timely fashion as I possibly can. But I do have to recognise that these are not all in my gift to give, and I'll be working closely with John and others where there is a time frame that's been specified and other parties are involved, then I'll be dependent on the cooperation of those other parties.
I've been doing this job for 4 years, and actually I'm quite pleasantly surprised by, I made endless recommendations with my colleagues here, and most of them get resolved one way or the other. They're not always agreed, but usually we work through them. Sometimes they take more than 6 months, as I know you know, Jackie. But I think we do try to produce recommendations that are achievable within a time period, and we have a process whereby we go back to those recommendations. And I know that Chris and the chief and the deputy, answer our letters and say what's happening. So it's pretty good, but it's not always perfect, and they don't always accept every single recommendation. And I think it would be a mistake if they had, because I think some of them need to be stretching. And this one, this set of recommendations is, for obvious reasons, given the absence of the work in Northern Ireland, not just the absence in relation to the PSNI, will take a bit longer. But I've got another year to go if I'm not in my job, and then I'm going to set up a little firm in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, and take cases and make sure all the recommendations are agreed, or I'll just make loads of money.
I'll jump in at this point. Okay. It's maybe also worth saying that the board has a performance committee, and John's reports all go through the performance committee, and that, I know you know some of this, Jackie, but that's where we try to keep the momentum. And I suppose that the workshop discussion that's suggested for January, not only will that help keep the conversation going, but we'll also keep a spotlight on it, and it's be a good chance to check in and just see where we are against some of those timelines. Okay. I'll keep turning myself off. Any other questions? No? None online either? No? Okay. You've bamboozled people this morning, John. So you have. Can maybe just one to throw out, and sorry, Chris, I'll throw it to you first of all. We had a few pre-submitted questions just prior to this morning. Some critics would say that technologies like facial recognition should not be used at all due to the potential for discrimination, such as, for example, against minorities. Would you have any position on that, Chris? And maybe I'll take a view from Fraser as well on that point in a minute. Out of you this morning, Chris.
No, thanks, Sinead. It's another good question, and earlier you asked about technologies that they develop in the future, and I said how difficult that is to predict. Facial recognition is one of those technologies which has been developing, and I've been watching with interest, and we absolutely need to have a position around facial recognition because it's here now. I've been having this conversation personally in different capacities for a number of years, and when I first saw the use of live facial recognition by law enforcement, I was concerned about the application of that and whether my service that I was representing should or shouldn't get involved in that. And if you look at, for example, some parts of the world where police services who weren't actually using live facial recognition were legislated against using it before they even contemplated using it. I'm talking about some of the states in the US, for example. It makes you think how important it is to return to that point that Fraser made earlier, or other people, our colleagues in Tonga made, about building the trust before you build the system. So live facial recognition is not being used in Northern Ireland, and there's no plans to do so. But you can never say never, because things do change over time. So we rightly highlight that there's been lots of research which has suggested that the technology could be discriminatory in that sense. It's more around the data, etc., and application. But one of the reports that's often referenced there is written by a colleague who I know very well. It's usually the one that people draw upon, and if it is that one, it's from 2016. So that's already gone 7 years out of date. So as the technology develops exponentially, our understanding needs to move with that. And the technology will naturally improve. And that's where I am on all these things, is to not necessarily jump in as an early adopter just because you can, but to see if there is a sensible application which would be useful to law enforcement, look at what the risks are, and then wait for the opportunity to develop with the technology providers perhaps the capability so that it addresses those challenges before we adopt it, so we do have that trust. So facial recognition, even the language is challenging, because we talk, and John knows this because I chair a board on behalf of the service, recognising that we need to understand these capabilities and make some very sensible decisions about what we do and we don't adopt. So there's facial recognition, but there's facial matching, and the language suggests that they're not the same thing. So you can use a similar technology which looks at one image against another image of somebody's face, which is biometric data, and you can do that in live time, which is very contentious and has a lot of risk. You can do it retrospectively, and I think most people would see the sense potentially in triaging hundreds of hours of CCTV material in order to focus on the key elements which might identify a suspect in a murder investigation, for example, and then rely on a traditional detective, a human being, to concentrate on that, because you can't look at those hundreds of hours unless you spend hundreds of hours. So using some of the technology in that less contentious, more retrospective space is a sensible consideration, and actually that helps you develop that technology so that the other capabilities might actually be safer in the future as well. So you need to look at these things in a very nuanced way sometimes, and that's why we have this board, that's why we have a lot of expertise around that table to advise me as the chair of that board about these subtle differences in capabilities which somebody might broadly term as facial recognition, but actually it's not what you expect it to be in terms of cameras on the street watching people walking up and down. It's picking out things from CCTV. It's looking at an image of a suspect on a CCTV frozen frame against a suspect's picture from custody and seeing if it's the same person, but ultimately then putting a human back in the loop to make that traditional identification which we all understand and rely on. So I guess trying to succinctly summarise that, I'm saying never say never, but there are no plans in Northern Ireland to use live facial recognition in the sense that you talk about there. But there are other applications of facial matching, etc., which do have sensible applications, and it's important we have policies in place so that we can build that trust before we adopt those systems if necessary.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. Commissioner, would you like to offer a comment?
Yes, please. Thank you for that. So, look, it'd be much more exciting, wouldn't it, if I disagree with everything Chris said, but I'm going to agree with most of it. I think there are already cases, I've made some cases actually in published articles in the US, where if the police if they had live facial recognition capability available and didn't use it, they would have to explain very convincingly why they hadn't used it, particularly if it was here on an Article 3 human rights compliance basis. But that comes from the availability of the technology, and somebody's got to decide to invest in it in order to make it available. I think the technology-driven solution is the wrong way. I think other countries and in parts of England and Wales, we have leapt in and been sort of fetishized the availability of new technology. And that actually puts you further back than you would have, the position you'd have started from, if you are ready to sort of deploy variants of it in the future. But the reality is the technology is getting much better, it's getting more reliable. I think we have to be very careful how we, or the results that we claim from some, I went to the Met's public release of their National Physical Laboratory findings recently, where they were reporting back on the algorithm and its reliability, the way they've used it for live facial recognition in terms of race and sex bias. What they report actually says in terms of scientific research is that when used at a specific threshold, the extent of bias on the grounds of sex and or race is no longer statistically significant. That's quite a difficult thing for me to say on Zoom. It's even harder for a chief officer to go out and kind of publicize, but that's the accurate description of it. So where it gets played out as, well, we've nailed race and sex bias in our algorithm, they haven't. And if it gets played out in that way, they will very soon find that they are having to resile from that. And you can't control that message once it's out, and then it's very difficult for you to kind of win back the public trust and confidence. I'm not in support of outright bans of any form of technology, largely on the basis of sort of pragmatism. It would be a very bold minister indeed that decided that the solution in every policing situation from now into the wild blue yonder would never have been solved appropriately and proportionately and responsibly by the use of certain technology. I just can't see anyone taking that option. If you ban certain types of technology as well from policing, you encroach on the accountability of the police, because I think, as with certain other types of technology, the police accountability and decision not to use certain types of technology will be as important as their decision to use it. If you put it beyond their reach, you've kind of diluted the extent to which they're responsible for that. I don't think this is an operational responsibility issue or independence issue. And again, some of the difficulty we're having in terms of the public conversation about this has been where we came from. I agree with Chris. If you're facing data on intrusive surveillance technology that was produced in 2016, that's the Pleistocene era. It's almost unrecognizable now to people who are producing modern algorithms. So again, it comes back to the public trust and confidence. People need to trust the way that the police will deploy it in the way that they've trusted them to deploy other contentious technologies such as Taser quite successfully. And they need to trust the technology providers. And one of the challenges that I'm coming up against is that if even the police can't trust their technology partners because they don't know what they're doing either with the algorithms or the data that it produces, then we're nowhere near starting to attach it to people's vests or put it in cars or fly it around on drones. But the process, I think, needs to be in place first. And the end goal may well be that there will be certain types of highly contentious and very intrusive technology that is being used by the police.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Les.
I just made one very quick point, and it's again about that trust issue, not about whether the technology works, but the one of the cases with the live trials of technology was South Wales Police, and it wasn't being trialled secretly, but they trialled it in 3 places. One was outside a police station, train station. One was in the city centre, but the third place it was used was outside a conference centre that was holding a conference on defence procurement, and there was a peaceful protest outside, and that was the third place that it was chosen to trial it. And one of the people who was protesting then took a case. Ultimately, at the Court of Appeal, that was held to be unlawful, in part to do with using too broad a legal framework. So it wasn't that the police were secretly recording this. They had something like 500,000 people. But whether, frankly, the purpose of doing it outside a peaceful protest in a defence procurement, and that's not the way to build public trust. If you're going to use it in those kind of circumstances where people are peacefully protesting, you're inevitably going to get people who wonder what the purpose of using live facial technology in that setting is. So it does take you right back to build the trust and then build the systems. And that's where I think we have to avoid going down that kind of road that South Wales and actually the Met were kind of, I think, went rather badly wrong.
Thank you, Les. Thank you. Okay, Linda, a question?
It's just a quick point.
Do you want to?
Question.
Okay.
Probably okay without the mic.
Well, it's for the Zoomers, just Linda, just if you don't mind. Thanks.
It's just a quick point rather than a question in terms of recommendation 5, which obviously not come as any shock to you, I'm sure, John, that I think that's one of the most important ones. That's about getting out and engaging with the public. But I think that we need to make sure when that engagement happens, it's in language that the public understand. So it shouldn't be done high level, at a level which, yes, maybe all of those who understand legislation and who are legally qualified and trained understand. We need to make sure that the people out there in the public understand it, because you won't build trust by telling people things that go way over their head and they're sitting wondering, what have you actually just said to me? So I think that's an important point just going forward.
Thanks for that, Linda. Really important. Okay. I think if there are no other, I don't want to curtail things, but I'm conscious that we've reached nearly 12. So if there are no other questions, can I just take this opportunity to thank you all for coming today, including the folk who've joined us online. To thank John for his expert advice and guidance, not just on this report, but generally throughout the last number of years to the board. It's beginning to sound like your leaving speech, John, but not yet.
I hope it's going to be longer than that.
No, okay, fair enough. I'll get a better one prepared. Can I also thank Fraser, the Commissioner, for joining us online. We really appreciate you taking the time this morning, and thanks very much for your helpful insights. Thanks also to ACC Chris Todd for your contributions, and Les Allenby, one of our board members. Thanks to everybody who had questions this morning. I think that really helped with the debate. I think, Fraser, probably you need to go to your friends in Tonga and get them to copyright that line about build the trust before you build the systems, because I can see Lorraine has probably already noted it down and has it in mind for future publications. We're really keen to engage, not just in this subject, but more generally on our work and have feedback. So if you have any comments or suggestions for us, we'll be really glad to hear any of those. So just a final thank you for joining us, and just a reminder that the footage will be published on YouTube later today at some point. Yeah. So thank you all. You're free to go.